Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to IBIA Conference on Bunkering and Shipping in Transition. In this session, we will be talking about alternative fuels for shipping, and I'm certain we will have a very interesting discussion for this complex and very opportune issue, given the global focus to reduce emissions of air pollutants through new types of cleaner burning fuels. Without further ado, I would like to welcome and introduce our distinguished panelists. Dr. Edmund Hughes, Director of Green Marine Associates Ltd. As we all very well know, Dr. Hughes was Head Air Pollution and Energy Efficiency in the Marine Environment Division of the IMO. Dr. Hughes was also responsible for IMO's work to address GHG emissions from international shipping, for which he was responsible for the development and adoption of the initial IMO strategy on reduction of GHG emission from ships. Chris Chatterton, COO of the Methanol Institute, the global trade association for the methanol industry. Chris has extensive experience across, among others, the energy, shipping, renewables, and chemical sectors, and manages Methanol Institute's CIS, Asia Pacific, and Middle East operations. Alexander Prokopakis, CEO of probunkers and very much the architect of the probunkers LNG project. Alexander has extensive experience in the shipping and bunkering industry and is also the chairman of IBIA's Bunker Licensing Working Group. Sobhit Hariharan, Team Lead Engineering Systems, Gas Technology Specialist in Lloyd's Register. Sobhit is Lloyd's Register's Regional Lead for Gas Technology aspects in South Asia. Sobhit leads service delivery of clean energy projects on LNG, LPG, maritime transportation, and novel fuel technologies such as ammonia and hydrogen. Additionally, Sobhit is actively engaged with maritime decarbonization and carbon intensity reduction projects. And Frederick Meyer, Head of Strategy, Total Marine Fuels. Frederick oversees a team that strategizes and executes key projects, R&D programs, and industry initiatives to promote low-carbon alternative fuels to Total shipping clientele. Now, gentlemen, I would like to welcome you in what I'm sure will be an extremely interesting discussion on one of the most, if not the most, widely discussed and debated topic, future alternative fuels. I don't want to take more of the time allocated to our panel, so I will go straight to our distinguished guests and start off with you, Edmund. Now, the shift to cleaner fuels is a transition whose end is surely nowhere near, as new entrants come packed with both pros and cons. How do you view the process to shift from fossil fuels to cleaner alternatives from the side of the contenders? Do you see a head start from many quarters, and is the current pace of preparation satisfactory?
Thank you very much indeed, Konstantinos, for the introduction. And good morning, everybody. For me, I think we're still very much at the early stages of considering this issue. I mean, we adopted the initial strategy, which I highlighted in my presentation, only in 2018. We're now in 2021, and of course, last year and we're still suffering the effects of the pandemic. And I think. You know, and of course, the recent events with the Ever Given incident in the Suez has demonstrated why international shipping is so important to the global community, and also the fact that these ships are the largest machines on the planet, and they require enormous amounts of energy to move them around to provide the service they do for trade and global commerce. So, as I said, I still think we're very much at the early stages. I welcome the initiatives that have been taken, such as by the Global Maritime Forum and the Getting to Zero Coalition, and they've highlighted many of the key issues that need to be addressed. But I still think it's very much early days, and part of that exploration is really understanding the risks associated with the potential alternative fuels and energy sources that are being considered. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very true. What about you, Sobhit? What is your take on the plethora of the, a theory at least, many alternatives we see?
Thank you, Mr. Captain Nikas, for the introduction and also for having me in this session. So as you have rightfully mentioned, there is currently a plethora of those options available to anyone. So as I discussed during my presentation, so just to name a few, of course, hydrogen, ammonia, we have biofuels, electricity, and of course, LNG when it comes to as an alternative option. But when we use our sort of a framework, which I mentioned, is in terms of looking at it from perhaps a technology readiness perspective and a community readiness perspective and also an investment readiness perspective. So if I happen to look at perhaps the technology readiness part, then we can see the engine makers or the technology providers are putting in significant amount of work to develop solutions for this. And when we look at shipyards, they are also partnering with a number of stakeholders to develop designs that are capable of using alternate fuel. So the MISC SHI project that we are closely involved with is one of such projects. As an example of demonstrating to the industry that these fuels are able to be used safely and commercially viable. So when we look at also the community readiness part, that's in terms of the development of those regulations that Dr. Hughes has mentioned. So we see that it also has to come up. So the life cycle emissions that he has mentioned is also key, but all of that could perhaps put some obstacles or some roadblocks in terms of the investment readiness or the financial feasibility of these projects to be adopted. So those are challenges which we see has to be overcome. But as we have seen, these are still very early days, and we really have to see what will be at least one of the few options to which we can actually narrow all these down to and adopt that widely over the industry. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sophia. Yes, I'm sure that we will be touching some of these aspects as we go forward, but I would suggest we start looking at some of the main contenders, so to speak. Alexander, you are an advocate of there is no silver bullet, and you have stated the case of LNG being a sort of bridging fuel for the energy transition. But how do you evaluate ship owners' reaction so far? And how do you view the current bunkering supply infrastructure, especially with an eye to the various challenges that Subhith mentioned and those that we will discuss further on?
Thank you, Konstantinos, for the invitation. Pleasure to be here. We had already a great day, and things are looking very good in this IBIA conference. I think we have a paradox. If we go just a few months back, we were living on if IMO 2020 will go forward and what's the implications and if it's needed. Now, ship owners are a little bit afraid of what's going to happen in 2050. And, it's very good to have a wide perspective and be afraid. But I think we all know that shipping is not an early adopter. If we need to characterize ourselves, we are late adopters. When we adopt, we do it very, very well and very quick. The thing is to actually make that decision. The feeling is that right now there is confusion. Ship owners are afraid that in a few years' time, the vessels are obsolete. Edmund can say that so far, the track record of IMO has never given any instances that any regulations coming up putting any part of the fleet obsolete. And let's be realistic. Nobody wants to, and as we saw now on this great Suez incident, nobody wants to jeopardize the good movement of cargo. So this confusion has created procrastination. So it's logical that ship owners are taking the time to see what's the best option. I truly believe, and I have said it, like you said, there's no silver bullet. In a few years' time, we're going to have a different fuel mix than we have today. Today, we have a dominant fuel that is fuel oil. I think it's going to be around for a good portion of years coming ahead. But things need to start changing. Either that will be LNG, like we are great advocates and we believe it's the best solution currently, or something else that will come down the line. The problem is that we cannot afford as an industry, as the environment, as a society to be waiting for that best ultimate solution. And we're just hoping that it will come. Right now, it doesn't seem so. So the logical thing to do is to start adopting solutions that exist today and take you further. Obviously, and I think we'll have a chance down the line, so I don't take a lot of time of the panel discussion, that each solution presents the pros and cons. I think it's, and you can agree, and Starbucks is a prime example, that it's a commercial decision. You are one of the few owners that you have made a decision to go forward with scrubbers. This was your commercial decision. It moved forward. You have your up and downs. At the beginning, it seemed like a great decision. At the beginning of the year, it doesn't seem because of the price changes, but at the end, you supported your decision. And I think that's what the industry needs to do. It needs to start making steps towards this cleaner environment, because unfortunately we're going to come at the end that these changes are going to be steeper. We're going to need to put more money into it, and this is going to be a problem. To finish up, the current bunkering infrastructure of LNG, some people say that the industry have made steps. I think we have made strides, and Frederick will be able to say that. But right now, LNG is available in most major ports. The bunkering vessels that come into line, all very expensive assets and very modern assets to support this part of the bunkering industry that a lot of we see great potential moving forward.
Great. Thank you. I agree about the commercial viability of the decisions being taken by all quarters. We will go back to this later on. Now, turning to you, Frederick, on the aspect that Alexander touched upon, the challenges, because on the bunkering infrastructure, we will discuss this. Now, Total has a wide decarbonization policy, focusing on GHG impact. But which are the major challenges for you going forward? I know that your marine policy is LNG aligned, but within the wider energy transition concept, apart from LNG, do you look further ahead considering other fuels as well, LNG and others?
Yes, thank you for the questions. I would say LNG is obviously a part of our strategy of bringing, I would say, low carbon solutions to the market, not only in shipping, but in various industries. And you are right. I mean, today our scope, I mean, we have announced publicly our target in 2050 to become net zero. And our scope is widening in terms of solutions. We are, of course, the group is actively I would say, looking at investments in different renewables, biogas, electricity, carbon capture, biofuels. So the scope is wide enough for us as Total Marine Fuel to leverage on our strengths within the group to offer, I would say, different solutions to the shipping industries. Obviously, the one we are focusing today is LNG for all the reasons Alexander mentioned before. But we don't see challenges ahead. We see opportunities, rather, to provide different low-carbon solutions for our customers in this industry.
Fair enough and true enough. Now, let's go to methanol. Chris, it appears that most agree that methanol's use can largely depend on the existing bunkering infrastructure, and its wide availability is an extra ticket to its large adoption going forward. Still, the major two barriers so far are its price and the fact that at present it is still mainly derived from fossil fuels, so natural gas, and its energy content is half than HFO and MGO. How do you see this evolving, and what are the suggestions that you would like to share with us at this stage?
Yeah, thanks, Konstantinos. Well, I can say to begin with that methanol is a liquid at ambient temperature, so that immediately suggests that moving it around, storing it, and making it available as a bunker is a little bit simpler than for some of the other cryogenic product out there. Mm-hmm. And it's been moved. It's on an international ocean-going basis for over 5 decades. So a lot has been learned over that time frame as to how to handle it safely and how to mitigate any potential safety risks. So it's and I guess within the same vein, it's loaded and unloaded in a very similar fashion as you would bunker it. So the parallels to bunkering it as or placing a methanol stem is quite similar to loading it as a product. And we have such experience for over 5 years on the Stena Germanica based out of Gothenburg, Sweden. And I think from a price perspective, it's quite predictable. So it's traditionally traded within a fairly narrow range if you look back historically, say over the past 10 years. And on an energy equivalent basis, because as you noted, methanol is only about half the energy content of, say, LNG or HFO, but which means you have to consume about twice as much. But having said that, again, the price is quite predictable because it's been used as a chemical building block across a range of subverticals.
Other industries, yes.
Yeah, so it's been available in a number of ports. Most ports globally have methanol storage to support these other industries, and as well as it being blended in gasoline and for biodiesel production already, as well as DME and even MTBE. So again, it's widely available. The pricing is fairly predictable, and it's now being picked up across several online trading platforms. So I'm quite certain that indexation will evolve very shortly before the end of this year. So the pricing will be even more transparent than it already is.
Yes, transparency on pricing is something which I can tell you from ship owners' point of view is something that we all eagerly look forward to, even if it concerns fuels that we're not obviously currently using, but we want to be seeing and comparing, as they say, apples to apples when it comes to pricing, because from there starts a series of calculations. Now, thank you, Chris. Now, so Keith, I would like to ask you this. We see many projects being implemented. You also mentioned it earlier. I would like your view briefly on two of these not touched upon so far in today's discussion. Most specifically on the Castor project to build ammonia fuel tankers, the one initiated, as you mentioned, by MISC, Lloyd's Register, Samsung Heavy Industries, and MAN Energy Solutions, together with MPA, of course, in Singapore. And what are the main challenges, very briefly, I know there are quite a few, in your opinion, for hydrogen?
Yeah, sure. So this Castor project, it was initiated basically as our industry's response to demonstrating that these projects involving low or zero carbon fuels are feasible, or we have to really address if there are such safety risks, if there are associated risks, how can these then be safely managed? So our role within this particular project is mainly in terms of looking at the safety risk process, put forward by this application. So if, let's say, for ammonia, we can see that it is, although we have significant experience carrying it on board as in LPG carriers, and also its use as a refrigerant, it is still a toxic gas. So if it's inhaled or if it's spilled, people exposed to this could be subject to some significant amount of danger. And of course, this also, although not really as flammable as what we would have for perhaps LNG or hydrogen, it is still flammable. It also possesses some amount of low temperature risks. So our role mainly was looking at, as part of this particular project, to look at if we are putting now tanks on board, fuel tanks, fuel process systems, engines that are capable of using ammonia, then what additional risk are we subjecting this ship and the people operating this to? Then, of course, once we know these risks, so we run design screening sessions, we run hazard sessions, HAZOP sessions with people who are really competent in all these technologies, and we identify all the risks that this could be generating on board. And then, of course, the design could then be improved by putting on board perhaps some mitigative or preventive measures. So we hope to take all these lessons also in the developing the rules that are associated with its use. So we have rules being developed at this point. We have guidance notes being developed as taking into account of all the lessons that we got from these sessions, we have discussion documents coming out, looking at the toxicity levels to which people can be exposed to and at which we should be able to detect this and all of that. So combining all of this, this project, when we get all these partners, of course, MPA and Yara has also joined in now. So
Yes.
representing the whole sort of ecosystem from the marine industry. So it will sort of form one of the first truly demonstrable pilot projects for the application of ammonia. So going into maybe the next question in terms of the hydrogen challenges, of course, hydrogen, we can see it is currently being seen as perhaps at least in the long term to provide the significant amount of energy that we would need perhaps for the marine and of course the world as a whole. But it has a significant amount of challenges. Again, if you look at the physical properties itself, we can see that it is extremely flammable. It requires like maybe minimal amount of ignition energy as compared to what we have for LNG or even ammonia. And it has to be either stored on board in compressed conditions or perhaps even at extremely low temperature cryogenic conditions. So for instance, temperatures of up to minus 253 C or pressures of up to maybe 700 bar or 300 bar conditions. But we see this is being also adopted, perhaps for short sea shipping, at least at this point. We have vessels running in Europe within LR class, which are ferries ferrying passengers in and around Europe. Again, we see because of the limited range that it can provide, because of its significantly low energy density, it will have a long way to go before any chance of getting adopted for deep sea shipping. So its safety risk has to be managed, and at the same time, its associated energy density challenges should also be managed. So that's in a brief that our view on this ammonia as well as hydrogen. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, as you said, and as I think Alexander has mentioned earlier, early days, but still all very much focused all parts of the industry. And Frederick, one of these is the Getting to Zero Coalition. Now, Total is a member of the Getting to Zero Coalition. And I would like your take on how would you comment on its recent report that there is a growing focus on hydrogen-based fuels, as Safith mentioned earlier, with 2020 seeing a, quote, notable increase in the uptake of large ammonia vessels as well.
Yes, we are members of a number of coalitions. Getting to Zero is one of them, of course. And we are very active in, I would say, 2 out of the 4, I would say, work streams, particularly on the first movers and energy transitions. The report you mentioned is about the mapping, which was done recently. Try to be as exhaustive as possible. So a very good update. When I read through, I would say I have maybe 3-4 comments. There was an increase, obviously, of the number of projects when you compare to the previous editions. It has increased from 66 to 106 identified projects, pilot, etc. You mentioned about hydrogen. I would say if you look more deeply in the analysis, whether you're looking at the large ships or the, say, small vessels, you would see that hydrogen is probably mentioned most of the time for, I would say, smaller vessel size, probably linked to a technology such as fuel cell, not necessarily combustions, because we may see some difficulties in the long distance, and I would say in implementing combustion as well. The second comment I would say is on the large vessel segment. You are right. Yes, ammonia is taking an increasing importance, and methanol as well, which is probably the reason why the Getting to Zero will focus in a new report, what they call the second wave, focusing on these 2 fuels for the coming 6 months, looking at more, I would say, economical study. Third comment would be on the geographical development. You could see that probably more than 70% of the project are based in Europe, probably because of the help of the public funding, which you don't see happening at the same pace in Asia, for instance. So you have much less occurrence in Asia. The last comment is in terms of specification of geography. You could see two areas where you see, I would say, all these projects developing. The north of Europe, without mentioning few countries such as Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, and in Asia, essentially in Japan, China, I would say North Asia. So for me, this report gives a sign that the pace is still there. The industry is accelerating the number of projects, and that there will be segmentations, whether you look at geography, whether you look at the type of vessel. So which means that every solutions will be part of it. And hydrogen is one of them in some particular segment.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. We see so many projects from so many quarters, and there is one word that we don't hear much. It's a quite different perspective, and I would like your take on that. This is the nuclear energy. We hear it, but very rarely. But I would like your view on nuclear energy as an alternative, and how does this possibility bode with the public perception, do you believe?
Well, thank you. And indeed, I mean, it is often not really been talked about in many of the projects that are ongoing. But for me personally, I think it is something that needs further consideration because it comes back to an energy question. And as the gentlemen have all discussed, and the various fuels being discussed at the moment, it all comes back to how we can provide energy to a ship. And the nuclear issue is not just about direct propulsion. It's also potentially about the energy needed to generate these zero carbon fuels that we're going to need in the future. And I think it's important to recognise that the goal is ultimately to have zero carbon. It isn't, that is the goal. And shipping, I'm afraid, is going to have to address that sooner or later. And to do that, we're going to need fuels that are zero carbon based. And how are we going to generate those fuels? Where's the energy going to come to produce that? And people talk about net zero. Well, again, we need to talk about absolute emission reductions. And nuclear is a real potential solution here. It is a zero emission energy source. It can be used, and I think the other thing that why I mean 10 years ago, if you'd asked me that question, I probably would have been like everybody else, very dismissive because of the problems of dealing with particularly pressurized water reactor technology. But the new technologies that are coming for nuclear, the advanced modular reactors using molten salts, frankly, provide many advantages without the disadvantages of nuclear or the term atomic batteries being used.
Yes.
I think that the key thing is it comes back to where we're going to generate the energy, and we know that governments are looking. There are governments like UK, US, China. Are looking at molten salt reactors, for example, particularly land-based reactors, where they can generate energy as for baseline load to provide energy to support to complement the renewable energy sources such as offshore. So as I said, it's something that I feel we do need to consider. There is quite a few people looking at this very earnestly and spending. I know the US, for example, US Department of Energy have just put out $80 million demonstrator project for these reactors. And as I say, further down the line, we're going to have to consider zero carbon. And maybe we're in a transition period where alternatives can be used, which are lower carbon. But I certainly think we have to consider zero carbon. And as I say, nuclear can provide that. And it's the other thing, the other question mark is energy density. And we've already seen with some of the disadvantages of some of the other fuels where they then have an impact on potentially the range of the vessel or the cargo carrying capacity of the vessel because of their energy density. And of course, the proposed nuclear reactors have incredible energy density. And as I said, and they address some of the serious public perception concerns there are with using nuclear. And as I said, I think there needs to be just a grown-up conversation. For me, I'm very disappointed when Neely, you mention it. People sort of are negative about it. And as I said, I'm glad to say, actually, I said it was reported just very recently that the EU are considering nuclear as a potentially sustainable energy investment from an investment point of view. So again, I think we have to have that conversation. We have to have that conversation in shipping.
Sure. Alexandra, you wanted to make a point, I think.
Yeah, I don't want to interject, but it's interesting, and we all agree, Edmund, that what you say, that we really need to start looking today on zero carbon fuels. There is an issue that we leave it aside, and it's already in existence. There is a problem of competent crew talking about regular operations. When we go to LNG, ammonia, hydrogen, it makes it even harder. When you start talking nuclear today, it's almost impossible. There's not enough engineers for land-based projects. Imagine what will going to happen in shipping. And safety perception, it's a great problem on this. So yes, it needs to be in the agenda in the long run, but we need to be realistic. What's the challenges around a more holistic solution for shipping and how these people can operate these very dangerous potential assets?
Yeah. I don't disagree at all, and it is one of the significant risks, in terms of competency of those who have to operate these vessels. But this is why I think the initial discussion is going to be around using these energy sources, using nuclear reactors to generate these electrofuels or the fuels that then are used on the ships. Because again, as we've already seen, the technical risks associated and the safety risks associated with those fuels, there's no zero risk here. I mean, we're talking about ammonia, which is highly corrosive and highly toxic. We're talking about hydrogen, highly explosive. There's no such thing as zero risk. We're going to have to manage, I would suggest, if we're going to go down the zero carbon route. And as I say, shipping may not have the choice here, everyone. We have to understand, that choice may be soon moving away from us in terms of what fuels we use in the future, because the politicians will just, as we see from Europe, for example, are getting increasingly restless about shipping and what the carbon footprint of shipping is. So we may not have that choice. So we have to accept perhaps that there's going to be greater risk along the line, not just technical and safety risk, but also commercial risk because of the uncertainty. And I would advocate here, we've seen where, for example, in LNG, where risk sharing has come in, and no doubt with methanol as well, risk sharing we've seen with Maersk now looking at methanol. That risk sharing is probably a model that may have to be employed more and more by the shipping sector with those who supply fuel to ensure that they can address these concerns. Because, as I said, there are huge uncertainties, but we're going to have to maybe think slightly more about how we address those uncertainties in a different way. Thank you. Yeah,
I mean, our aim here is to address. There are no taboos, I would think and hope. We have to consider everything. Of course, some vessels, some fuels have the advantage of having the setup already and some technological background, but others. This is why I mentioned nuclear, and we will mention others as well as we go along. But apart from these general challenges, we have challenges today, and these concern the actual bunkering procedures themselves. Now, Chris, you mentioned earlier your introduction to methanol bunkering, the one that you issued last year with a collaboration of Lloyd's Register. There, you acknowledge that there is an amount of uncertainty by way of bunkering procedures. I would like to ask, what has been the progress in understanding the bunkering principles since then? How do you view the bunker industry's reaction so far? And if I may also add one more angle to this, about the Institute's views and proposals concerning the current limited bunkering facilities for methanol, despite the apparent similarity, as you said, of the bunkering principles themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, You're right. There is very little bunkering capacity for methanol in place at the moment, but that's more of a factor of not very many ships requiring it. But that's likely to change very soon. I mean, methanol was only recently approved by the IMO for inclusion in the IMO's interim guidelines for low flashpoint fuels in November of 2020. So at the moment, there is only LNG and methanol, which are approved as compliant fuels. So having said that, I mean, again, much of the required infrastructure to physically bunker methanol is already in place, or it can be existing infrastructure can be repurposed to bunker methanol in a similar fashion as, say, distillate fuel. And there are a number of pilots already. I mentioned the Stena Germanica, but there are others which are bunkering smaller vessels, to include fuel cell propelled vessels, and these are mainly retrofits. So it's the bunkering of methanol is really well understood at this point. We have a planned demonstration of a barge to ship operation scheduled for May of this year in a major European port that will be announced probably soon. But I think regarding existing bunker suppliers' experience, of course, it's very limited because they haven't had any demand, and this is clearly a demand-driven industry, both for the technical specification, price, and ease of delivery. But again, as it's quite similar to bunkering distillate fuel or say a drop-in fuel, the learning curve won't be very steep, in my opinion.
Yes,
and, it should take off fairly quickly. Do it once, and I think it'll be easy to understand.
Yes, this demand-driven principle, which is of course applicable, as you say, is the chicken and egg. I mean, first demand, and then the theoretical guidelines and the similarity will hopefully show. Now, we don't have this with LNG so much. So I would like to go to Alexander now. And as we all know, Alexander, the oil majors so far have been driving the LNG bunkering development. But in terms of the bunkering and the provision of this fuel, do you believe there is room for independent suppliers like probunkers? And we've been talking with Frederick about Total, and we will touch upon that again right after you. But what's your take on that?
Yes, thank you, Konstantinos. It's very important that so far the two majors have been driving the business. The market needed that assurance in order to start making steps. And this is a small differentiation that I have with Chris is I believe that in any such industry, supply needs to be there and demand will come. Because for ship owners, it will be very, very hard to make any decision if the supply is not there. So the majors have made this initiation. They started providing the supply in order to see the demand that this have becoming. So all this time, it has been generating by back-to-back projects, big collaborations with major uptakers. Now it's the critical point for a more commercial and better development of LNG as a fuel for more suppliers to get into the game, independent suppliers. We have seen that in traditional oil bunkering, the majors, it's not their core business. They like the industry, they want to be in it, they want to secure the supply, but this is not the core business. So now, in order to see more development in LNG as a fuel and LNG bunkering, independent suppliers, it's a big capex issue, of course, because we're not talking about like traditional bunkering that with few millions you can get into the game. LNG bunkering is different, and it's good to stay like that different because we need to safeguard the safety requirements, the good operations in order to see better and better players coming into the game.
Good. Well, all players are welcome, obviously, and one of the big ones is Total. Now, Frederick, a two-angle question for you, please. What has been Total's experience in the regional setup of LNG as a sellers and the port infrastructure? I'm asking this because, as we all know, Singapore's MBA has awarded an LNG bunker supply license to Total Marine Fuels. And how do you view this development in your overall bunkering process targets? And how do you specifically view Singapore's preparedness? And to touch a little spice on that question, how often do you hear this infamous question about the methane slip for the LNG, and how does that possibly affect your discussions?
Okay, many questions at the same time.
Answer as many as you like. We have time.
Okay, so regarding the experience of developing what you call this regional setup, I would say you have to keep in mind, it's a lot about anticipations, integrations, and harmonizations. We need to anticipate the development of a fleet which will be dual fuel LNG. So we are not simply waiting for the vessel to be built. We have to really anticipate well ahead. And yes, obviously there is some risk to be taken, but I would say this is part of our business. And having probably partners in such a long project, it takes quite a few years to develop this project for LNG bunkering. Anticipation is a key because you need to time precisely when your delivery will be ready when it comes and phase, I would say, properly with the customer's requirements. Integration is all about the infrastructures. You need to integrate at the very beginning, thinking your whole supply chain from the molecule. I would say the molecule is not an issue today because you have ample and much more supply that you can think of for the LNG bunkering, which is taken a very small share of the global LNG market. We're talking about less than 2%. And you need to integrate all this supply chain going through the infrastructures, terminals, the dedicated barge. I would say the authorization is part of the project. So we are extremely proud of being awarded, of course, the license by the MPA in Singapore. And finally, harmonization is all about a lot of works on standards, regulations, which you have to really start working very early in the phase in the project to have when the barge is ready to deliver, everything has to be ready for the customer to be able to have a bunkering operation in the most safe conditions. Mm-hmm. Regarding the Singapore, I think we believe Singapore is going to be the major hub in Asia for LNG bunkering. Let's not forget about the position today in the conventional fuels. We have seen extremely cooperative, I would say, and supportive from the actions from the NPA, from the governments. We believe Singapore is definitely have plenty of I would say, competitive advantage in the region to grow fast this offer of LNG and others, not only LNG, but other alternative fuels. So it is part of our strategy. After, of course, Europe, Singapore was obviously the hub to be. And regarding your last question on methane slip, I would say we are working on it very actively. It's definitely an issue we have to tackle technically based on our R&D. So we are working on it on the upstream, of course, because we are, of course, a gas producer and LNG exporter. but also working very closely with all the OEM, with the engines manufacturer. There have been already a great achievement in terms of improvement of reducing the emission on the methane ship. And we expect, looking at the different R&D projects, again, to have significant reductions in the coming years.
We certainly hope so, because this is something that we keep on hearing. But okay, thank you all about this. Now, let's look a little bit as we draw to a close at the wider picture. Now, Edmund, I'm really wondering, do you believe that there is adequate time ahead for all these shattering changes that we're talking about, which are needed to accomplish IMO's GHG's ambitions? I mean, I don't want to sound as a heretic here or anything, but wouldn't you think that carbon capture could be a more effective and all-inclusive solution to which more focus should be exercised?
Yeah, thank you. I certainly, I mean, there is time. I mean, as has already been addressed, I mean, I think one thing that this industry and those who work with this industry demonstrate continually is its ability to innovate and also to deliver. I mean, the industry has been delivering for this for the global economy very successfully the last 50 years and really made the world it is today. I think there is time. I think you're right. As I said, as I mentioned before when we talked about nuclear, I think we cannot discount anything at this stage. We need to think of all options. Carbon capture is certainly part of that equation. I think, I see the initiative by, for example, Wärtsilä have talked about developing a scrubber technology for carbon capture. I'd be delighted to, and I've been looking to see what the technology is behind that. But I think I think we have to think about these things and see what comes up. And that again is why we have to be. For me, it's a case of we have to walk before we can run, and certainly understanding that the risk is something that is important. And that's why, again, one of the initiatives that's going on at the moment at the IMO is the proposal for an R&D fund for which is we'd see a contribution of $2 per ton of fuel oil collected from international shipping to provide a potential fund of over around $5 billion. And that fund would be used to support research and in particular development of prototypes because I think that is the huge uncertainty we have at the moment is that people don't want to move forward because they're unsure of what the outcomes will be, particularly when you take a technology and you marinize it, you put it on a ship. And I think that's where we need real support, maybe from governments as well as independently, but I think collectively as the global international shipping sector, that's where something like that proposal could really support that moving forward in terms of understanding those risks.
Yeah, I agree with you, and that reminds me, Chris, of a recent statement I believe you've made that the challenge of achieving net zero emissions should be shared along the supply chain and not placed on the ship owners alone. Could you please elaborate a bit on how you view this spreading of burden? And if you are referring to the whale-to-wake concept, how so, if so?
Mm-hmm. Yes, some fuels will inherently be more competitive depending upon things like the voyage, region, vessel type, maybe proximity to larger fuel hubs, as well as access to renewable power and prices for such power. So with the major focus on green hydrogen going forward and over the long run, and on the most efficient hydrogen carrier, maybe you could say. So there's space for all these fuels, within certain applications. They just have to be worked out. So I think therefore, demand for such fuel will be required in order for producers to produce a fuel, say, which is going to be of a specification that's going to be attractive technically, and at the right price point. And in this respect, we're very focused on an LCA basis, longer term, So this allows us to balance the costs, timing, carbon policy that's evolving, as well as these investments required to achieve IMO compliancy all the way out to 2050 or beyond. And currently, almost all major methanol producers now have sustainability programs in place and are already producing low carbon methanol, just as shippers are decarbonizing, because in a lot of cases their clients are demanding it as well. Those, for example, those Nike trainers or television sets or what have you that are being delivered across the globe by ocean-going vessels. These brands are also very much focused on their sustainability aspects, and that's all moving upstream into the shippers themselves. So, there will be many more carbon neutral methanol producers that are now already scaling up their projects in anticipation of more robust carbon policy, and that's leading to a lot more collaboration across all the alt fuels, and trying to bring them to market to make them more available efficiently. So I think that's a trend that's going to continue to take place, and I think we'll see more emphasis on LCA basis versus purely onboard emissions, and that will be driven by stakeholders from one end of the value chain to the other.
Great, thanks. I will use the words that you mentioned: sustainability, availability, and time. Now, Subhith, would you agree with both Edmund and in terms of having time to go ahead with all these changes needed to accomplish the IMO's GHG emissions? And about sustainability, availability, can you make a brief reference, because we haven't so far, on the biofuels aspect, which is it's becoming a bit popular, especially in the ARA region lately?
Yeah, sure. So I think I will echo what Dr. Hughes and Chris has mentioned in terms of the compliant timelines and whether we'll be able to achieve that. Of course, from a shipbuilding perspective, or the designs coming out of that, addressing the risk or the technology wise, I'm pretty confident that yes, these will be available and ready. But I have maybe just to add 2 points, perhaps, is in terms of the price point, which Chris has also mentioned, because these fuels, when we consider the life cycle analysis part, of course, if it has to be produced from renewable sources, it's going to be considerably more expensive than fossil fuels. So for ship owners or charterers to actually make that particular decision to carry on with that investment, they will definitely have to look at some form of compensation that could be carbon pricing. So decisions on that, perhaps from IMO or from other bodies, has to also come up so that these investments can go ahead. And at the same time, it's also about the availability part. So is the industry or the shore-based industry ready to actually supply these renewable-based fuels at the kind of volume and price points that the marine industry at this point or in future could expect? So those two aspects to me still uncertain, but in terms of the industry's readiness to come up with the science and technology, I'm pretty confident. So perhaps just to add in terms of the biofuels, so as you rightly pointed out, the main key consideration there would be the sustainability aspect. So if we are to be able to produce biofuels at the volume that's actually required to replace the fossil fuels, then how about the land use? How about the sustainability part for other food crops? So those are definitely challenges. Again, there is also the additional challenge in terms of perhaps the more obvious part is in terms of the increase in perhaps NOx emissions that perhaps could come up with the application of blended fuels, which contains some amount of biofuel. So of course, that also brings us to the point in terms of the carbon emissions contributed directly from biofuels. Of course, if we are not really looking at it from a life cycle analysis perspective, then biofuels are not really sufficient to look at or reduce the carbon emissions that coming out from ships, because it will have equivalent level of emissions as fossil-based fuel. So how would we then account for all of that? Will also be part of the challenge that we have to overcome. Yeah. So that would be my take. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, unfortunately, we're running out of time. This is proving to be even more interesting than we all believed. But so I will just address a quick question to all of you for a closing note. And of course, we're all available for our Q&A session thereafter. Very quickly, on a general note, Edmund, IEA says that global CO2 emissions are rising again after nearly 6% fall last year. Now, you said we have time, but how more urgent or quicker do you believe the discussion on future alternative fuels should be? And what can the bunker industry itself offer to the table by way of proactive preparedness or feedback?
Thank you. Well, there's two questions. First of all, on the emissions side of things, I think one of the focus, and this is why in the short term, the focus is on energy efficiency and particularly reducing the carbon intensity of international shipping, because anything we can do to improve the energy efficiency of the fleet will mean that there's going to be less demand for the fuel to supply the fuel to enable that fleet to move around in future, the low and zero carbon fuel. So energy efficiency is very important in the short term. From a point of view of the bunkering industry, I think their input is very important from a perspective of supply. And we've heard that you've mentioned the chicken and eggs supply conundrum here, and I think what the bunker industry can do is provide information on how that supply can be stimulated. Provided, but we have seen initiatives, say, for the EU at the moment. The EU is coming forward with the Fuel EU Maritime Initiative, and that's a focus very much on the supply side. But it would be very helpful to have the input. We've seen some comment from EXA, for example, but it'd be helpful to have input from the bunkering industry about how the supply side can be stimulated to enable these alternative fuels to be forthcoming. Thank you.
Thank you. Frederick, would you, excuse me? Sorry. Okay. Frederick, do you think it's a time for someone to tell to ship owners to move in a specific way or not? I mean, the target are the buyers, the sellers, the buyers of the fuel themselves. And they are quite mixed in what they hear and they receive as feedback. What's your advice as we speak now?
Yeah, I agree. They have mixed signals. I would even say there are a bit of confusion in the market because you have many options on the table, not many solutions viable today. There is a lack of visibility on the regulation. That is true. So you have uncertainties. And I usually say that the shipping market, the industry is going from a very simple world, very comfortable world, where you had to rely on one single source of fuel, abundant, cheap, available everywhere, and you're going into a more complex market, where you're going to have extremely increasing complexity in terms of pricing. There's no more dollar per ton. You're going to talk energy. You're going to have to factor in the CO2 price. You're going to have to factor in the route according to the new bunkering spot or hub for this several new supply and fuels, which will not be available, all of them at one place. So it's going to be increasingly complex. I agree. There is some doubt and difficulties to make decisions when you don't have all the cards in your hand. It's true. So that's why the message, I would say, and let's not forget that up to now, the shipping industry did not pay much for the infrastructure. When you look at LNG, it's amazing. All infrastructure was paid by other industry. The terminals were not built and paid by the shipping industry. The risk on the barge is mostly taken by the suppliers of the LNG. So I agree that there should be, I would say, a more balanced risk-taking in the emergence of new solutions, not only LNG, but other fuels. And that I agree that we should have more trust from the market and believe in the new solutions which are emerging today and tomorrow with the low carbon or zero carbon fuels. And we need to definitely to share the risk.
Okay, great. 1 minute, max each of the remaining, I guess. Alex, it's here, it's tested, it's available, could be LNG's motto. Is this enough to induce ship owners to proceed now?
It should be, but eventually it's not. I would say that which else alternative or which fuel can make this claim of the three things that you mentioned? So it should be enough, but unfortunately it isn't. The good thing that I need to mention here is that 2020 was a good year for ordering new build vessels of dual fuel LNG. According to our projections, better than we expected. So this is a great sign, but things needs to move along. So to conclude within that 1 minute, it should be, it's not enough right now. So we all need to do a better job explaining things that needs to progress.
Yeah, the 1 minute works because it brings out the gist of the challenges. Does that apply to you, Chris, as well, you believe?
Yes.
The challenge, to induce ship owners, I mean.
Yeah, I mean, we're working with a number of ship owners already, and they're making inquiries and evaluating the options, and again, that it impacts their ability to invest. They're looking at timing for their own sustainability programs and how fast or measured they can bring forward new technology and incorporate these new fuels to maintain some compliancy. So we have a lot of work ahead of us, and looking forward to helping everyone achieve their decarbonization goals.
Let's hope so. Well, we are just about wrapping this up, but we have, I'm sure, a very interesting Q&A session coming up. I know I have some questions that I didn't have the time to ask all of you, both from the contender side and from the more, let's say, impartial side of this panel. I would like to thank you very much for this very interesting discussion, and we are now ready for our Q&A session.